I brought a powder blue bicycle for Maya that morning. My daughter-in-law Elena answered the door. She didn't take the bicycle. She placed a laminated sheet on the kitchen island and turned it to face me. Saturdays only. 2 hours. No unapproved gifts. I looked past her at my son Chris, the man I raised. He was staring at the floor, shoulders down, not moving. Like a man who had already made a decision he couldn't take back. Elena leaned forward. Maya's development program runs $4,000 a month. If you want to stay in her life, your share is $1,500. Monthly. Direct deposit. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. Weeks later, I started looking. Maya's education fund nearly empty. Credit lines opened in my name without my knowledge. Money that had moved quietly, for years, to places I was never meant to find. My name is Frank Miller. 69 years old, retired building inspector. 35 years finding what people hide inside structures that look perfectly sound from the outside. They built this carefully. They just didn't know who was going to inspect it. The bicycle had taken Frank Miller 3 weeks to find. Not because bicycles were hard to come by in New Jersey, there were sporting goods stores on every other corner. And the internet could deliver one to your doorstep before the afternoon was over. No, it had taken 3 weeks because Frank was particular. He'd walked the aisles of 4 different shops, pressed his thumb along the welds of a dozen frames, tested the give of handlebars, squeezed brake cables. The way he used to test load-bearing joints 40 feet above a Manhattan sidewalk. 35 years as a building inspector had made him that way, careful, patient, and unwilling to sign off on anything that wasn't exactly right. The bicycle was a 14-inch, powder blue Schwinn with white handlebar grips and a small silver bell on the left side. Maya had mentioned, exactly once, that her favorite color was the sky right before it rains. Frank had remembered. He drove the 40 minutes from his house in Parsippany to the Colonial in Milburn on a Saturday morning in October. The bicycle disassembled and wrapped in moving blankets in the bed of his pickup. The maples along Route 24 had gone gold and amber, and the air through his cracked window smelled like dry leaves and the particular cold that meant the season was turning for real. He'd made this drive hundreds of times. He knew every exit, every long curve where the highway dipped toward the wetlands. He knew the exit ramp that fed into the residential streets, the way the houses got progressively larger and newer. The lawns more manicured, the driveways broader, as you moved deeper into Milburn's school district. He had always liked coming here. That was the truth of it. He had always felt something ease in his chest. When he pulled up to the Colonial, when he thought about Maya inside, when he imagined her face when she heard the truck in the driveway. He assembled the bicycle on the front walkway, using a hex wrench from the small kit he kept behind his driver's seat. The handlebars clicked into alignment. The bell tested clear and bright in the October stillness. He straightened up, pressed both hands to the small of his back, and looked at the house. It was, objectively, a beautiful house. 2-story white Colonial with black shutters, a covered front porch, and a yard that was edged so precisely it looked machine-cut. Frank had been to houses like this all over northern New Jersey, properties where the owners had invested as much in appearance as in structure. He respected the care it took. But he had also learned, over 35 years of pulling permits and reading blueprints, that the most attractive facade could be sitting on the worst foundation. Beauty and soundness were not the same thing. They looked the same from the street. They were not the same thing. He picked up the bicycle by the frame and carried it up the front walk. He was raising his hand to knock when the front door opened. Elena was dressed in what Frank had privately come to think of as her Saturday uniform, fitted black athleisure. Hair pulled back in a way that managed to look both casual and deliberate, a ceramic mug in her right hand. She was 39 and looked it in the way that people who spend money on looking a certain age look it. She blocked the doorway without appearing to block it, which was, Frank had noticed, one of her particular talents. Frank. She said his name the way people confirm an appointment. Morning, Elena. I've got something for Maya. He lifted the bicycle slightly, presenting it. Elena's eyes moved to the bicycle and then back to him. Something passed across her face, brief, controlled, and legible to Frank the way a stress fracture is legible in concrete once you know what you're looking at. "Come in," she said. But first, she stepped back into the foyer and returned with a single laminated sheet of paper. She held it out to him with both hands, the way you'd present a document you expected to be signed. Frank took it. It was printed in a clean sans serif font, the kind of font that belonged on a corporate memo. At the top, in small caps, Miller Family Visitation Protocol effective October 1st. Below that, 2 columns. The left column was headed Scheduled Visit Dates. The right column was headed Blackout Dates, and listed, among others, every 3rd weekend of the month. All school holidays, and Frank read this twice to make sure he was reading it correctly, the first and last week of December. Below the 2 columns, a section headed Gift Policy. All gifts or items introduced into the household for minor children must be pre-approved by parental unit no less than 72 hours in advance. Unapproved items will be returned to the gifting party. Frank stood in the doorway holding the laminated sheet. The blue bicycle leaned against the porch railing behind him. He could hear the house, the particular quality of silence inside a well-insulated home, the faint sound of a television somewhere upstairs, and beneath it, very faintly, the sound of Maya's voice, talking to herself the way she did when she was playing alone. He read the document a second time. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. "Elena," he said finally, keeping his voice even, "when did this become necessary?" "It's not about necessity. It's about structure." She took a small sip from her mug. "Consistent structure is proven to reduce anxiety in children Maya's age. We're following developmental guidelines. I'm her grandfather, which is exactly why we want the relationship to be healthy and well-defined." Frank looked down at the laminated sheet one more time. Then he looked up at Elena. "Is this a home, Elena, or a museum?" She held his gaze without blinking. "Would you like to come in, Frank?" He followed her inside. The house was as immaculate as it always was, surfaces clean, furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom. Nothing left where it hadn't been intentionally placed. Frank set the bicycle inside the front door, not knowing what else to do with it, and followed Elena into the kitchen. She moved to the island and set her mug down with a small, decisive click. He was about to ask where Chris was when something on the counter caught his eye. It was a financial statement, the kind that came quarterly from investment accounts. He could see the header from where he stood: College Savings Plan 529 account summary. The rest of the document was partially covered by Elena's handbag, a large, structured leather bag in caramel brown that had probably cost more than Frank's first car. He could see the account number, a partial column of figures, and what appeared to be a withdrawal summary at the bottom of the visible portion. He did not look long. He looked the way a professional looks, quick, cataloging, moving on before the look became a stare. He shifted his gaze to Elena, who was already talking about Maya's weekend schedule, something about a class in the afternoon and a play date that had to be coordinated. Frank nodded at the appropriate intervals. He was listening. He was also, with the quieter part of his mind, doing what he had done for 35 years, noting anomalies, filing them, and waiting. It was when Elena stepped out of the kitchen to call up the stairs for Maya that Frank, standing alone for a moment, noticed the drawer. It was a narrow drawer below the kitchen peninsula, the kind meant for miscellaneous papers and takeout menus. It was not quite closed. The corner of an envelope had caught in the runner, leaving it open half an inch. Frank did not open the drawer. He did not touch anything. He simply looked at what was visible. The envelope was windowed, the kind used for official correspondence. Through the clear plastic window, he could see 3 words in red ink: "Past due notice." Below the red text, partially visible, the name of a mortgage servicer he recognized from his years of dealing with property documentation. Frank straightened. He heard Maya's feet on the stairs, that particular quick, irregular rhythm of a 7-year-old in a hurry. He heard her voice calling, "Grandpa," and he turned toward the kitchen doorway and arranged his face into the expression she expected from him. The one that was entirely real and entirely his: open, warm, glad. He caught her as she came around the corner, lifted her, felt the familiar solid weight of her, and held on. Over her shoulder, the drawer sat slightly open. The red ink was still visible. I spent my life making sure foundations were solid, he thought, feeling Maya's arms around his neck. Now, my own son's house feels like it's built on quicksand. He held his granddaughter tighter, and he said nothing, and he filed everything away. The call came on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the bicycle visit. Frank was at his kitchen table, eating leftover chicken soup from a container he'd made on Sunday, when his phone buzzed against the tabletop. He looked at the screen. Elena. He set down his spoon, wiped his hands on a paper towel, and answered. Frank. Same tone as the doorway. Same calibrated neutrality. I hope I'm not interrupting. You're not, he said. Good. I wanted to reach out about something that would benefit everyone involved, including you. I was thinking we could find time this week to sit down and talk through Maya's developmental program. There are some financial components I'd love to walk you through, if you're open to it. Frank looked at the soup. Financial components. It's all very positive. I just think a proper conversation would be more productive than trying to cover it in passing. How does Thursday look for you? There's a Starbucks on Springfield Avenue that's easy for everyone. He said Thursday was fine. He spent the next 2 days trying to talk himself out of the feeling that had settled in his chest since the call. A feeling he recognized from his working life, from the moment just before he wrote up a violation. When all the individual observations he'd been holding separately suddenly resolved into a single coherent problem. He had learned, over 35 years, to trust that feeling. He had also learned that it was worse, in some ways, when the structure in question was something you cared about. Thursday was overcast and cool. The Starbucks on Springfield Avenue was busy at 10 in the morning. The post drop-off crowd, parents with strollers. A line of people in business casual waiting for mobile orders. Frank arrived 5 minutes early and found a table near the window. Elena arrived at exactly the scheduled time, which he had also expected. She set a leather portfolio on the table between them, the kind with a zipper around 3 sides, and ordered a flat white before sitting down. Frank had coffee, black. He watched her unzip the portfolio and remove a single laminated sheet, and felt something that was not quite surprise. The sheet had the same font as the visitation protocol. At the top, Maya Miller Elite Development Investment Summary. Below that, a column of itemized expenses: private tutoring, specialized language curriculum, enrichment programs. A waiting listed private school assessment fee, a child development consultant. At the bottom of the column, a monthly total $4,000. Maya's development is our absolute priority, Elena said. She had a way of speaking about Maya's development that made it sound like a construction project with a fixed deadline. Chris and I are committed to giving her every advantage. But the reality is that comprehensive elite development at this level has real costs. Frank looked at the sheet. He recognized the technique, the itemization, the professional formatting, the use of language that made objection seem like an objection to Maya's future, rather than to the document in front of him. I can see that, he said. What we're proposing is a monthly access contribution of $1,500. Think of it as an investment in your relationship with Maya, a structured way for you to be part of her development. Elena folded her hands on the table. The families who are most involved in a child's elite educational journey are always the ones who have real skin in the game. The phrase landed in the space between them. Frank let it sit there for a moment. Skin in the game. As if 35 years of showing up, of driving 40 minutes every other weekend, of remembering that Maya's favorite color was the sky before rain, as if all of that were not skin. As if the $80,000 he'd given toward the down payment 3 years ago were not skin. As if he were a new investor being courted, rather than a grandfather being assessed a fee for access to his own grandchild. He looked at the laminated sheet. He looked at Elena. He said, "Let me think about it." She seemed to have expected this. She nodded, zipped the portfolio closed, and they talked for another 15 minutes about nothing in particular: Maya's reading level, the school's fall festival, the traffic on Route 24. Then Elena left, and Frank sat alone at the corner table and finished his coffee. He drove home in the gray October afternoon and did not turn on the radio. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with his 401k statement in front of him. The quarterly summary he'd received in the mail 2 weeks earlier and set aside without opening, the way he'd gotten into the habit of doing. The way people do when they've been living alone for 6 years. And the financial paperwork is a reminder of planning done for a future shared with someone who is no longer there. He opened it now, unfolded it, and read it through. The account balance was what he expected. The activity log was not. There was a credit inquiry notation, a soft pull from a financial institution he did not recognize, timestamped 3 weeks earlier. He read it twice. It was the kind of inquiry associated with a new credit application, a joint account or co-signed line of credit. Frank had not applied for any such account. He set the statement down and sat very still in his kitchen. He thought about when Elena had asked for his social security number. It had been in the spring, March, maybe, or early April. She'd called and explained, in her efficient way, that she was updating the household's insurance documentation. Something about a supplemental policy that would extend coverage to extended family members, and that she needed his social security number and date of birth for the application. He had given it without thinking twice. She was his son's wife. She was Maya's mother. The request had the texture of routine paperwork, and Frank had spent a working life dealing with routine paperwork. And so he had read the number off to her over the phone and hadn't thought of it again. Until now. He pulled out his reading glasses and examined the credit inquiry notation more carefully. The institution name was unfamiliar, not a major bank. Not a name he recognized from any of the standard financial advertising he'd been exposed to over 69 years. It could have been a credit union. It could have been a private lender. It could have been something else entirely. He reached for a legal pad. He kept one on the table. Had always kept one somewhere in the kitchen, for lists and measurements and the kind of note-taking that kept his mind organized. He wrote down the institution name. He wrote down the date. He wrote down the amount of the inquiry, which the statement did not specify, only logged. He sat back in his chair. The kitchen was quiet in the way that a house becomes quiet when you have lived in it alone for long enough that the silence has its own texture. On the counter, the pill organizer sat in its usual place, 7 compartments. Each loaded on Sunday evenings, the sedative in the Thursday slot because Thursday evenings had a way of running long with worry, which was something his doctor had noticed before Frank had admitted it. He looked at the organizer. He thought about the $1,500 monthly contribution. He thought about the credit inquiry. He thought about the social security number he had read off the phone in the spring, without hesitation, because why would he hesitate? They didn't want my company, he thought. They wanted my equity. He did not take the sedative. He looked at his wife Diane's photograph, which sat on the counter between the pill organizer and the coffee maker, a snapshot from 1987, Diane laughing at something off camera. Her hair caught by a lake breeze somewhere in the Poconos. He looked at it for a long time. His hand had developed a fine tremor in recent years. Nothing serious, nothing that interfered with anything. Just the acknowledgement of time, but it was steadier than it had any right to be tonight. He uncapped his pen and drew a line beneath the notation on the legal pad. Below the line, he began a list. It was not a list of grievances. It was not a list of fears. It was, with the precision of a man who had spent his career documenting structural problems before anyone else could see them, a list of observations. What he had seen, what he had heard, what he had been asked to sign, or to pay, or to accept. The order of events, as clearly as he could reconstruct it. The social security number and the date he had provided it. The 529 statement partially covered by the handbag. The past due mortgage notice in the drawer. The $80,000 that had moved from his account to the down payment 3 years ago. He filled 2 pages. Then he capped the pen, folded the legal pad open to those pages, and set it beside the 401k statement on the table. He had not yet drawn any conclusions. That was not how the process worked. In 35 years of inspections, he had learned that the most costly mistake an inspector could make was to decide what the problem was before he had finished looking. You kept looking. You kept documenting. You kept the conclusions off the page until the evidence was complete. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he slept. Maya's soccer league played its Saturday games at a complex of fields behind the Milburn Middle School. A broad, well-maintained stretch of municipal turf that filled up on October weekends with folding chairs and collapsible canopies, with parents in team colors holding travel mugs. With siblings chasing each other along the sidelines while the younger children ran in the cheerful, disorganized fashion of 7-year-olds who have not yet fully grasped the geometry of the game. Frank arrived early. He had brought a folding chair, the same lightweight aluminum chair he'd used at every outdoor event for the past 12 years, and he set it up near the midfield line. Close enough to see Maya's face clearly, but not so close to the other parents that he'd be crowded. He'd dressed warmly flannel-lined khakis, a heavy gray sweater, a down vest he'd owned since the 90s that still did its job without complaint. He had a thermos of coffee. He had been looking forward to this. Maya's team was in yellow. She played midfield with the earnest, slightly chaotic energy of a child who has been told to stay in her zone, and interprets this instruction as a general suggestion. Frank watched her take the field with the other children and felt the thing he always felt watching Maya, a fullness in his chest. Uncomplicated and complete, the feeling of something in the world being exactly as it should be. Elena arrived 10 minutes later with a folding canopy, 2 camp chairs, and a tote bag large enough to contain a weekend's worth of supplies. She set up the canopy with practiced efficiency, erected the chairs beneath it, and arranged herself in the left-hand chair with her phone in one hand and a stainless steel bottle in the other. Chris was beside her, looking at the field with the expression of a man who is present in body and elsewhere in mind. He'd lost weight since the summer, Frank noticed. He looked like someone who slept poorly and had stopped mentioning it. Frank raised his hand when Chris glanced over. Chris raised his back, a small gesture, and looked away. The game began. Maya touched the ball twice in the first 10 minutes, which Frank logged with the same precision he brought to everything, and both times she did exactly the right thing. Passed to a teammate who was in a better position. He called out to her on the second pass. A straightforward, good pass. Maya. The kind of thing grandfathers called out at youth soccer games across the eastern seaboard every Saturday morning. Elena turned in her chair and looked at him. Frank. Her voice carried the exact distance required, not loud enough to draw wider attention, precisely loud enough to reach him. We try to let them play without a lot of external input. It can be overstimulating. Frank looked at her. He looked at Maya, who was already 20 yards downfield and had not appeared to notice anything at all. He looked back at Elena. She's 7, he said. She's playing soccer. Developmental sports psychology is very clear on this. Unsolicited adult commentary disrupts internal motivation. We've talked about it with her coach. She turned back to the field. Frank sat with his hands around his thermos and watched the game. A cluster of PTA mothers had set up to his left. He'd seen some of them before, at drop-offs and school events. The women Elena gravitated toward, the ones who treated the management of children's social calendars with the seriousness of project management. They talked among themselves, and the game proceeded, and Frank found his way to the particular quiet patience he'd always been able to locate inside himself when a situation required him to wait. It was during halftime, while the children clustered around their coach and Frank was refilling his thermos cap with coffee, that he heard Elena's voice carry from the canopy in a way that suggested she was not trying to keep it from carrying. Bless him, it's not his fault. It's a lot for someone his age. Frank did not move. He listened. His daughter-in-law is right there, one of the mothers said. Which is exactly why I've been so cautious about Maya's exposure, Elena said. The tone was warm with concern, the tone of someone who wanted you to know they were being generous in their restraint. The increasing forgetfulness. The repetition. Chris has been talking to a specialist, but you know how it is, the families are always the last to really accept it. A pause. The murmur of sympathetic sounds from the other women. We've had to put some protocols in place, just to keep things consistent for Maya. Children that age need consistency, especially when there's uncertainty in the extended family. Frank stood very still. He had spent 35 years reading structures, not just the visible surfaces, but the systems underneath, the load pads, the way force distributed itself through a building's bones. He had learned to recognize the moment when a structure was no longer behaving the way it appeared to behave. When what looked like stability was actually managed collapse. held in temporary equilibrium by something that would eventually give way. He understood, standing at the edge of a youth soccer field in Milburn, New Jersey, on a gray October morning, with his granddaughter 20 yards away and his coffee cooling in his hand, exactly what was being built here. He understood it the way he understood blueprints, not as a feeling, but as a fact. Elena was not keeping him out. She was producing documentation. She was creating, in the minds of the women around her, a record of Frank Miller as a man in decline, as a liability, as someone whose presence in Maya's life required management and limitation. She was not doing this because it was true. She was doing it because it was useful. The forgetfulness, the protocols, the framing of routine grandparental behavior, calling out encouragement at a child's soccer game as evidence of a problem. She's not just locking me out, he thought, with a steadiness that surprised him. She's erasing me while I'm still breathing. The halftime whistle blew for the second half to begin. Frank sat back down in his chair. He watched the children take the field, watched Maya line up with her team, her yellow jersey too big for her and her cleats already muddy. It was near the end of the game, in the complex's parking lot, that Frank saw Elena's brother. He knew the man only slightly, had met him twice at holiday gatherings. A heavy-set man in his early 40s named Derek, who described his occupation as consulting, in the way that people describe their occupation when they prefer not to be specific. Derek was standing at the far edge of the parking lot, near a black SUV that Frank did not recognize, and Elena was standing beside him. They were not speaking loudly. Elena had something in her right hand, an envelope, standard letter size, which she passed to Derek in the unhurried manner of people who have done a thing before and have no expectation of being watched. Derek put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket. Elena said something Frank could not hear. Derek nodded. Then Elena turned and walked back toward the field, and Derek got into the black SUV and pulled out of the lot. Frank watched the SUV go. He noted the make, the model, the partial plate number visible as it turned onto the street. He noted the time on his watch. He noted the fact that Elena, returning to the canopy, gave no indication of having been anywhere other than the canopy. He sat in his aluminum chair until the game ended, until Maya came sprinting off the field and threw herself at him with both arms, until he caught her and held her and felt, under his hands, the particular solid warmth of her. Over her shoulder, he watched Elena watching him from beneath the canopy. He gripped the cold rails of the aluminum chair with one hand and held Maya with the other. And he said, quietly, as much to himself as to anything else, "I'm not going anywhere, Elena." She did not hear him. She wasn't meant to. He let Maya go when she squirmed down to chase a teammate. And he folded his chair, and he walked to his truck, and he drove home, and he added 3 new items to the list on the legal pad. The letter from the attorney arrived on a Wednesday, in a standard business envelope with a return address in Chatham. Frank recognized the format before he opened it. He had received enough official correspondence over the years to know the particular weight of a legal document. The way the paper inside was slightly heavier than ordinary stationery. He stood at his mailbox at the end of the driveway, in the cold November gray, and held the envelope for a moment. Then he took it inside, set it on the kitchen table beside the legal pad, put on the kettle, and opened it while the water heated. It was 2 pages. The firm's letterhead at the top, a name he didn't know, an address in Chatham. The body of the letter was written in the precise, airless language of legal correspondence, language designed not to communicate, but to establish, to position, to foreclose. The letter informed him that his recent conduct had caused significant distress to the Miller household. It enumerated specific instances: an unannounced visit that had disrupted Maya's scheduled programming, a gift introduced into the household without the required advance notice, verbal behavior at a youth sports event that had alarmed other parents and raised concerns about Frank's capacity for appropriate interaction with a minor. The 3rd page he turned to, it was a formal cease and desist regarding all unannounced contact with the Miller household, and all direct contact with the minor child outside of scheduled, pre-approved visitation windows. Frank read it twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it from the slight distance of a man who is trying to understand what he is looking at. The visit, described as unannounced, was the bicycle delivery, for which he had called ahead that morning. The gift was the bicycle itself, which he had carried up the front walk and which Elena had accepted into the house. The verbal behavior at the sports event was, as far as he could reconstruct, calling out encouragement during a 7-year-old's soccer game. He thought about what it would mean to someone reading this letter without knowing any of those facts. He thought about the PTA mothers. He thought about Elena's voice carrying precisely far enough during halftime. He thought about the word, capacity. He placed the letter on top of the legal pad. The kettle clicked off. He poured the water over the tea bag and left the mug on the counter and did not drink it. The refusal to sign the liability waiver had happened the week before. A document Elena had produced during a brief interaction at the front door when Frank had come to drop off a book Maya had left in his truck. The waiver was 3 pages, single-spaced, and indemnified the Miller household against any harm to the minor child that might occur during visits with Frank Miller, including but not limited to physical injury, emotional distress, and developmental disruption. Frank had read it standing in the doorway and said, without particular heat, that he was not going to sign it. Elena had said, with the calm of someone who had anticipated this response, that she'd have to discuss with Chris whether continued access would be appropriate without a signed waiver on file. 3 days later, he had received a text from Chris brief, clearly drafted with input, saying that visits would be paused while the family worked through some concerns. And now the letter. He was officially barred. That was the practical reality of it. He was a grandfather who had been formally, legally prohibited from unannounced contact with his granddaughter by a cease and desist letter from an attorney he had never met, on the basis of conduct that bore so little relationship to what had actually occurred, that the distortion of it felt, in its own way, like a kind of violence. Frank moved from the kitchen to the living room and sat in the chair that had been his for 20 years, a big, upholstered armchair that faced the window overlooking the backyard, where the maple he'd planted when Chris was born had gone bare for the winter. He looked at the chair across from him, the one that had been Diane's. It was still exactly where she'd kept it, still turned at the same slight angle she'd preferred because of how the afternoon light came in. He had not moved it in 6 years, and he did not intend to. He looked at the photograph on the side table, Diane in the Poconos, laughing at something off camera. He had looked at that photograph every day for 6 years, through things that were genuinely difficult, and things that were only moderately difficult, and it had generally steadied him. Today he looked at it and felt the full weight of the distance between the life he had imagined at 69 and the life he was actually living. He had imagined, he had believed, with the uncomplicated confidence of a man who had done what was asked of him, that the years between 65 and the end of things would look like this: a house paid off, a pension solid, children and grandchildren visited freely, Maya growing up with his presence in it, the kind of continuity that made a life feel complete. He had imagined being a patriarch. He had imagined the treehouse in the backyard, the Sunday dinners, the ordinary accumulation of ordinary days with people who were his. At 69, I thought I'd be a patriarch, he thought. Instead, I'm just a line item they're trying to delete. From the kitchen table, in the silence, his 401k statement and the legal pad and the attorney's letter formed a small archive of the damage. He had not yet processed the worst of it, the most recent thing, the thing he had discovered 2 evenings ago, when he'd spent 3 hours on the phone with his financial institution's fraud line. The unauthorized withdrawal attempt on his 401k account. Not an inquiry this time, an actual attempt to initiate a transfer, $22,000, flagged and blocked by the institution's monitoring system, but attempted. The account connected to a routing number he did not recognize. The attempt time-stamped to a Tuesday evening. Elena had called him that Tuesday afternoon. He had checked a brief call, ostensibly to update him on Maya's school schedule, the kind of call that kept a phone conversation in the recent call log, the kind that could be referenced later to establish ordinary communication. He sat in the armchair and looked at the bare maple through the window, and the full shape of it assembled itself in his mind the way structural failures assembled themselves, not all at once, but feature by feature, each observation clicking into its place in the larger picture, until the picture was undeniable and the question was no longer what was happening but what to do about it. The financial fraud, the legal letter, The reputational groundwork laid at the soccer game. The cease and desist that made it procedurally difficult for him to make contact. The credit inquiry on his social security number. The $80,000 already gone. They were steps in a sequence. He had been an inspector long enough to know that when you found one violation in a building, you did not assume it was the only one. You went looking. He stood and went back to the kitchen and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator where he kept the manila folders. He took out 4 of them, labeled them with the pen from the counter, and began to transfer the documents, the 401k statement with the withdrawal notation in one folder, the attorney's letter in another, the legal pad in a third, the credit inquiry notation in the fourth. He set them side by side on the kitchen table and looked at them. He reached across the table and picked up the 529 plan brochure, the one from Maya's education account. The one Elena had given him 2 years ago when the account was opened, when everything had still looked, from the outside, like a family. He turned it over in his hands. The cover showed a small child running across a campus quad, the future rendered in glossy stock photography, bright and unambiguous. He set it down on the table. It was, at this moment, the only thing left that connected directly to Maya's future, the thing that had ostensibly been the point of all of this. The education account, the stated reason for the financial conversations and the contribution requests. He was going to need help. He accepted this without the resistance he might have felt earlier in his life. The resistance that comes from a man's idea of himself as the person who handles things, who fixes the problems, who doesn't ask. He was 69 years old and a retired building inspector and a widower, and whatever was happening in the Colonial in Milburn was beyond the scope of what one man with a legal pad and a filing system could address alone. He knew exactly one person who might be able to help. He picked up his phone and found the contact and looked at the name for a moment. Then he set the phone down without calling, because it was late, and because there was one thing a 35-year career had taught him above all else. You did not make your move until the documentation was complete. He sat in his kitchen for a long time, with the folders lined up in front of him and Diane's photograph on the counter and the pill organizer in its usual place. And he did not take the sedative, and he did not fall apart. He stayed exactly where he was. Friends, thank you for staying with Frank through these first 4 chapters of his story. We've watched a proud, careful man, a grandfather who spent his life making sure things were built right, slowly realize that the people closest to him have been dismantling his life from the inside. The bicycle rejected at the door, the access fee at the coffee table, the whispered words at the soccer field, and now a cease and desist letter, sitting on a kitchen table that was supposed to hold Sunday dinners. Frank hasn't made his move yet, but you've seen something in his eyes, haven't you? The quiet, the stillness, the folders lined up on the table. The inspection isn't over. And the man who spent 35 years finding what others missed, he's just getting started. Stay with us. 3 years ago, it had been a Sunday in April. Frank remembered the light, the particular thin gold of early spring, the way it came through the dining room windows of Chris and Alina's apartment. The one they were about to leave for the house. The table had been set for 4: Frank, Chris, Alina, and the realtor, who had stepped out to take a call and left the 3 of them with the closing documents spread across the white tablecloth. Frank remembered the folder. Elena had prepared it. She prepared everything. In those days he had admired that about her, the competence of it, the way she moved through logistics, the way some people moved through rooms. As if the space had been arranged for her in advance. The folder contained several documents: the purchase agreement, the title transfer, a gift letter for the financial institution, acknowledging the source of the down payment. He had not read them carefully. That was the truth of it, and he was old enough now to look at the truth directly. He had not read them carefully because he had trusted his son, and because Elena had her hand on his arm while she walked him through the pages, and because the realtor was coming back. And there was a momentum to the afternoon that made stopping and reading feel like an interruption of something good. He had signed where Elena indicated, 3 times on different pages. And he had handed the pen back to her, and she had hugged him and said, "The door is always open, Frank." Always. He had believed her. He had believed her the way you believe the things people say at the beginning of things, when everything is possibility. And nobody has had reason yet to show you what they're made of under pressure. He had believed her the way, in his early career. He had occasionally believed a contractor who assured him a foundation was poured correctly before he'd looked at it himself. Eventually, you learned that the assurance was not the inspection. The $80,000 had moved from his savings account to the escrow on a Tuesday. He had watched the transfer clear on his computer screen and felt the particular satisfaction of being useful. Of having something to give, at a moment when giving it made a difference. He had thought about Diane, who had always said that money was most valuable when it was moving toward something that mattered. He had thought she would have approved. He had not thought about the paperwork he'd signed. He had not thought to get copies of everything, which was the first thing he told young inspectors: always get copies of everything. Now, sitting in his kitchen in November, 3 years and several disasters later, he thought about the consulting firm name Elena had mentioned once casually, in the context of her side business. The business she'd described as marketing consulting for pharmaceutical clients. She'd said the name while talking about something else, the way people mention things they expect to be unremarkable. He had filed it away without knowing he was filing it, the way the mind stores details it doesn't yet have a category for. He had a category for it now. He wrote the firm name on the legal pad in capital letters. He circled it. The money he had given was not a gift. He understood this completely now, not as a suspicion, but as a structural fact. The way, after an inspection, a violation is no longer a possibility but a documented condition. The gift had been the entry point. The paperwork for the tax office had been the mechanism. The 3 signatures he had provided without reading were, in all probability, something other than what they had been described as. He had built his career on finding what had been hidden or misrepresented or hoped to be missed. He had written up violations in buildings owned by people with far more money and far more lawyers than Frank Miller had ever had, and he had written them up clearly and without apology. Because the integrity of a structure was not a negotiable thing. A foundation was sound or it was not. The numbers did not care about relationships, or about the light through a dining room window in April. Or about a hug and a promise that the door was always open. He drew a line beneath the circled firm name. Below it, he wrote a single sentence: the money was never a gift. It was the first brick in a wall built to keep me out. He looked at what he had written. Then he picked up his phone, found the contact, and this time he pressed call. It rang twice. "Ray," Frank said, when the line connected. "It's Frank Miller. I've got something I need you to look at." Raymond Kowalski had spent 22 years as a building department investigator before a bad knee. And a generous pension calculation had moved him into private practice. He ran his operation out of a converted Victorian on South Street in Morristown. The kind of office that looked, from the outside, like it belonged to an accountant, which was deliberately the effect. He was 64, compact and gray-haired, with the particular stillness of people who had spent decades in situations that rewarded patience over speed. Frank had known Ray since the 90s, from shared inspections on a series of contested commercial properties in Essex County. Ray was not a man who responded to urgency with urgency. He responded to evidence. They met on a Thursday morning. Frank arrived with the 4 manila folders, the legal pad, and a USB drive containing the photographs he had taken. The partial 529 statement visible behind Elena's handbag, the past due notice in the partly open drawer. The envelope passing between Elena and her brother in the soccer field parking lot. The photographs were taken with his phone, quickly, without flash, with the steadiness of a hand trained over decades to document without disturbing the scene. Ray spread the contents of the folders across his conference table and looked at them without speaking for a long time. Frank did not fill the silence. He had learned that the right response to a man examining evidence was to let him examine it. "The credit inquiry," Ray said finally. "You didn't initiate this." "No." "Social security number?" She asked for it when? "March." Said it was for an insurance extension. "Family coverage." Ray wrote something on his own legal pad. "And the withdrawal attempt on the 401k. This was flagged by the institution?" "Blocked. They called me. I have the case number." Ray nodded slowly. He pulled the attorney's letter from its folder, read it, set it aside. He looked at the legal pad's timeline. He looked at the photograph of the envelope exchange in the parking lot. The brother, Ray said. Alina's brother. What do you know about him? Frank told him everything he knew, which was not much: the name, the 2 holiday encounters. The word, consulting, the description of a man who was careful about what he said around people he had not yet assessed. Ray wrote it down. The consulting firm she mentioned, Frank said. He gave Ray the name he had written on the legal pad. Ray looked at it. Something shifted very slightly in his expression, not surprise, but recognition. I've seen that name, he said. Not this case. Different context. Give me a couple of days. Frank gave him the retainer check before he left. Ray looked at it, folded it, and put it in his desk drawer without ceremony. I'll call you Tuesday, he said. Tuesday came. Ray called at 9 in the morning and asked Frank to come in. The conference table was covered again, this time with Ray's own documents, printouts, financial summaries, corporate registration records pulled from state databases in New Jersey and Delaware. Ray stood at the head of the table and walked. Frank threw it with the methodical clarity of a man who understood that his job was not to have a reaction but to deliver a structure. The consulting firm was registered as an LLC in Delaware, 3 years ago, the same month as the house closing. The registered agent was a name Frank did not recognize. But the operating address on file with the New Jersey Foreign Corporation registration was the Milburn Colonial. The firm had no web presence, no client list, no publicly traceable revenue. What it did have, per the financial trail Ray had assembled through a forensic accounting contact, was a pattern of incoming deposits from multiple sources, followed by outgoing transfers to a private account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. The sources of the incoming deposits included Frank's $80,000, routed through the closing costs in a way that obscured the categorization. Payments from at least 2 other extended family members, a total of $23,000 across 4 transactions, which Ray had traced through transaction records obtained through legal channels, and monthly transfers from a joint account held by Chris and Elena, which appeared to be the $1,500, access contributions, collected from other relatives, including an amount that matched what Elena had solicited from Frank at the Starbucks meeting. The 529 account, Maya's education plan, had been opened with Frank as a named contributor. The account balance had been $47,000 18 months ago, per the partial statement Frank had photographed. The current balance, per records Ray had obtained, was $6,400. There was no documented educational expenditure to account for the difference. The credit applications, 2 of them, it turned out, not one had been submitted using Frank's social security number and date of birth. Both were for lines of credit under a joint account structure that listed Frank as a co-borrower. Both had been initiated without his knowledge. Both were associated with the consulting firm's financial network. Frank sat on the other side of the conference table and listened to all of this with the steadiness he had trained into himself over 35 years of finding things that were wrong. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly to the numbers. He listened until Ray had finished, and then he said, "The forged credit applications, are those signatures mine?" "No," Ray said. "We had a document examiner look at the photocopies. The signatures are approximations. Good approximations, but approximations." Frank looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the printouts, the corporate records, the forensic accounting trail that Ray had assembled in 10 days with the competence of a man who knew exactly where to look. He thought about the dining room table in April 3 years ago, and the light through the windows, and the folder Elena had prepared with such professional efficiency. Anger is a powerful fuel, he thought. But precision is what wins. He reached across the table and picked up the pen Ray had set down, and he signed his name on the forensic accountant's retainer, a separate engagement. A specialist Ray had recommended, who could prepare the financial documentation in the form required for legal proceedings. His signature was steady. It was exactly his own. "I want to document everything," Frank said. "Every dollar, every signature, every transfer. I want a paper trail that leaves no room for interpretation." Ray nodded. "That's exactly what we're building." Frank set down the pen. He looked at the table full of evidence, the thing that had been happening around him for 3 years. The thing he had only begun to see at the doorway with the laminated protocol in his hands, now assembled in full in the clear fluorescent light of Ray Kowalski's conference room. He thought about Alina's voice at the soccer field, carrying precisely as far as she intended. He thought about the cease and desist letter sitting in his kitchen. He thought about Maya, and the 529 account, and the $47,000 that was supposed to be her future. He thought about what he would do with it all. Ray, he said. Who do we call first, the forensic accountant or the district attorney's office? Ray allowed himself a small smile. Let's get the accountant's report in hand first. Then we make some calls. Frank picked up his coat from the back of the chair. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday, Ray confirmed. Frank walked out of the Victorian on South Street into the cold November air. And he drove home, and he sat at his kitchen table, and he began to prepare for the last inspection of his career. He called ahead. That was important to him, that there be no misrepresentation, no ambush, nothing that could later be characterized as anything other than what it was. He called Alina's cell phone on a Thursday morning and left a voicemail in his ordinary voice, the one that had delivered 35 years of professional findings to contractors, developers, and building owners who often did not want to hear what he had to say. Alina, it's Frank. I'd like to come by Saturday morning to discuss the $1,500 monthly contribution arrangement. I have some questions about how the money's been managed, and I think it would be better to talk in person. 10 o'clock, if that works. She called back within the hour. She agreed to 10 o'clock. Her voice was measured, with the specific quality of composure that people employ when they are trying to determine what you know. Frank thanked her and ended the call. He spent Friday evening reviewing the documents one final time, the way he had always reviewed his inspection reports the night before submitting them, not looking for new information, but confirming the integrity of what he had already found, making sure the structure of the argument held under its own weight. The forensic accountant's report was 42 pages. Ray had provided a 6-page summary keyed to the most significant findings. The forged credit application copies had been certified by the document examiner. The corporate registration records and offshore transfer trail were organized chronologically, cross-referenced with the dates in Frank's original legal pad notes. He put everything in a large brown envelope, the kind he had used for decades to submit inspection reports to the building department. He sealed it. He wrote nothing on the outside. Saturday morning was clear and cold, the first real cold of the season, the kind that felt permanent rather than seasonal. Frank drove to Milburn in his truck. He parked in the driveway. He picked up the brown envelope from the passenger seat and walked to the front door. Alina answered before he knocked. She had been watching for him. The kitchen was immaculate, as always. Chris was at the kitchen island. He had clearly been told to be there, placed there the way furniture is placed, part of the staging. He looked at Frank when Frank came in, and his expression carried something Frank had not seen in a long time. A kind of quiet dread, the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy and suspects he is about to be asked to set it down. Maya was not in the house. Frank had asked about this in the call, said he thought it might be better if Maya visited a neighbor or a friend during their conversation. Alina had said she'd arrange it. Good. Whatever happened in the next hour was not for Maya. Frank set the brown envelope on the kitchen island. He set it in the center, in the exact space where the laminated visitation protocol had been placed the morning he'd arrived with the bicycle. He did not open it immediately. He stood on his side of the island and looked at Alina. Thank you for making time, he said. Of course. Alina's voice was professional, pleasant, offering nothing. Her hands were folded on the counter. She was dressed as if for a business meeting, which she was. I want to talk about the $1,500, Frank said. I want to talk about the $23,000 from your sister-in-law and your cousin. I want to talk about the consulting firm registered at this address that has no clients and a Cayman Islands account. And I want to talk about Maya's 529 plan, which had $47,000 in it 18 months ago and has $6,400 in it today. The kitchen was very quiet. Chris looked up from the island. Something moved across his face, not surprise, Frank thought, but the particular look of a man who has been halfway knowing something for a long time, and has just been told he is no longer permitted to not know it completely. Frank, Alina began. I'm not finished. His voice was even. It had always been even when he was delivering findings. I want to talk about the 2 lines of credit applied for in my name, using my social security number, with forged signatures. I want to talk about the withdrawal attempt on my 401k in October. And I want to talk about the attorney's letter, and the dementia story at the soccer field, and the liability waiver. And all of the other architecture of this arrangement. He pushed the envelope across the island. Today, the numbers said out loud what I'd been screaming in my heart for months, he said, looking at Chris. Everything that's been done is documented. 42 pages of forensic accounting, certified document examination, corporate registration records, and offshore transfer records. Ray Kowalski prepared it. He worked with a forensic accountant and a document examiner. It's all in that envelope. Chris reached for the envelope with a hand that was not entirely steady. He broke the seal and drew out the first several pages and looked at them. His face changed. Elena reached across the island not for the envelope, but past it, toward the counter behind her, where a shredder sat beside the printer. I wouldn't, Frank said. He said it quietly, but Elena stopped. There's a copy of everything in that envelope at Ray's office, and another copy with the attorney I retained last week. And another copy that was submitted to the Essex County District Attorney's Office on Thursday morning. Frank's voice did not change. Destroying one copy of a document that's already in the hands of law enforcement is a separate problem to add to the existing ones. Elena did not move toward the shredder. She stood very still, her hands at her sides, and Frank watched something pass through her. Not remorse. He didn't think, not yet. But the particular adjustment that a person makes when they understand that the architecture they have built is no longer standing. Chris was still reading. He turned a page and then another, and then he set the papers flat on the counter. And put both hands on them and looked at the surface of the island between his hands. He did not look at Elena. He did not, for a long moment, look at Frank either. Dad, he said finally. The word came out stripped of everything except itself. I know, Frank said. I didn't. Chris stopped. He started again. I didn't know about the 401k. Or the credit applications. I didn't. He stopped again. Frank looked at his son. He had thought about what he would feel at this moment. He had examined the question over several sleepless nights in November. Turning it over the way he turned over structural problems, looking at it from different angles. He had thought he might feel rage. He had thought he might feel grief. What he felt, standing on the opposite side of the kitchen island from his son, was something quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of a man who has been a builder his whole life, looking at something that has been damaged and trying to assess what can still be salvaged. The DA's office will be in contact, Frank said. With both of you. He looked at Elena when he said the second part. She met his eyes. He held them. Whatever legal situation you're in now is yours. I didn't choose it for you. You chose it. He picked up nothing from the counter. He had not brought anything into this house that he intended to take out of it. He walked through the kitchen and into the front hallway, and he put his hand on the doorknob, and then he stopped. He turned around. Chris had come to the kitchen doorway. He was holding the first page of the forensic report in one hand. He looked the way Frank had sometimes seen men look at his own inspection. Reports, the look of someone seeing, for the first time, what the structure they'd been living in was actually made of. She's my daughter, Frank said. Whatever happens between you and Elena, Maya is my granddaughter, and she is not a bargaining chip, and she is not an access fee. That is not going to change. Do you understand me? Chris looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. Frank nodded once. He opened the front door and walked out into the cold. In the driveway, he sat in his truck for 5 minutes before starting the engine. He was not shaking. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, the same steadiness he'd always managed when the finding was complete and written and submitted, when the work was done. And what remained was whatever the structure's owner decided to do with the information. He started the truck and drove home. The treehouse took 6 weeks. Frank had done the measurements in December, working in the cold backyard with a tape measure and a notepad, assessing the maple tree, the one he'd planted when Chris was born. 41 years ago, with the same professional thoroughness he'd brought to every structure he'd ever evaluated. The tree was healthy. The primary branches were well positioned, the fork at 12 feet solid and properly distributed to bear a platform load. He noted the dimensions. He sketched a design on graph paper at the kitchen table that evening, to scale, with the load calculations in the margin. He pulled the building permit from the Parsippany Township office the first week of January. The clerk, a young woman who clearly hadn't expected a 69-year-old man to come in with a full set of drawings for a residential treehouse, looked at the plans and then looked at him and said, "You used to be an inspector, didn't you?" 35 years, Frank said. She stamped the permit with something that might have been admiration. He worked on Saturdays and Sundays, and on the days when the weather allowed during the week. He worked methodically and without hurrying, the way he had always worked. He used pressure-treated lumber for the frame members, stainless steel hardware throughout, no exceptions, and a floor decking of smooth cedar that he sealed 3 times with exterior finish. He built the railing to code, tested every joint, and added a rope ladder that could be taken inside in bad weather. He installed a small hinged window on the south wall, which would catch the afternoon light. Maya had seen the frame going up during her first weekend visit in January. The first visit since the proceedings had begun, arranged through Chris without Alina's involvement, a Saturday afternoon that Frank had kept simple lunch at the kitchen table, a walk around the block, the backyard and the emerging treehouse. Maya had stood beneath the frame with her head tipped back, looking up at the platform skeleton against the winter sky. "Is it mine?" she'd asked. "It's yours," Frank said. She had not asked questions about why things had been different for a while, about the weeks without Saturday visits, about whatever she had been told at home. She was 7, and 7-year-olds lived in the present tense with a completeness that adults had largely forgotten how to access. She had accepted the treehouse the way children accept things that are being done for them as a simple, reliable fact. Frank had watched her run back across the yard to the house, and felt something in his chest that he recognized as the specific relief of a thing being intact that you had feared was broken. By February, Chris had moved out of the Milburn Colonial. He was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Madison, 20 minutes from Parsippany, 15 minutes from Maya's school. The separation was formal and in process. The legal proceedings against Alina were a separate matter, moving at the careful pace of financial fraud cases, which are built on paper and take time to build correctly. Frank's attorney had explained this with the same measured clarity Frank appreciated in all professionals. The documentation was strong. The district attorney's office had confirmed the case was moving forward, and there was a timeline, and the timeline required patience. Frank was patient. He had always been patient. He deposited his Social Security check on the first of the month, as always. He reviewed his 401k statement with a clarity he hadn't brought to it in years, because for a while he had not been able to look at it without the stomach drop of the unauthorized withdrawal attempt, and now the account was secured and monitored and the attempt was part of the legal record. He reconciled his accounts. He paid his bills. These were not dramatic acts, but they were his, each dollar accounted for, each decision his own, and that ownership, which he had come to understand, was never something he should have taken for granted, felt solid under his hands. On a Sunday afternoon in early March, with the first real suggestion of spring in the air, the mud-seasoned smell of the soil turning over, the forsythia behind the back fence just beginning to yellow at the tips, he put the finishing touches on the treehouse. He climbed the rope ladder with a small hand drill and 2 stainless steel eye hooks. Secured the pulley rope he'd rigged so Maya could haul a basket of supplies up when she was too loaded down to climb one-handed. He descended, stood back, and looked at the completed structure. It was sound. Every joint, every connection, every surface. He knew this the way he had always known it, not because he hoped it was true, but because he had checked. Maya was in the backyard 10 minutes later, pulling on her boots by the back steps while Chris stood in the doorway with a coffee mug, watching. She went up the rope ladder faster than Frank expected, hand over hand, feet finding the rungs with the confidence of a child who has been practicing in her imagination for months. She reached the platform and put her head out the window and looked down at him. "Grandpa," she called, "you can see everything from up here." "I know," Frank said. "I designed it that way." She disappeared back inside, and he could hear her moving around on the platform, the creak of the cedar under her weight. The small sounds of a child exploring a space that was entirely her own. He stood in the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets and felt the particular quality of a Saturday afternoon in early March, cold enough that his breath was still visible. Warm enough that you could stay outside without thinking about it, and did not try to name what he felt, only let it be present. Chris came off the steps and stood beside him, looking up at the treehouse. "She's going to live up there," Chris said. "That's the idea." They stood together for a moment. Between them, the history of the past year sat in the way that hard things sit between people who are trying to find their way back to each other, present, but not the only thing present. "I should have," Chris began. "You're here," Frank said. "We'll work on the rest." Chris was quiet. Then he nodded. In the treehouse, Maya called something down that was not entirely intelligible, one of the running monologues she conducted in her private spaces. Conversations with herself or imaginary companions, the internal narration of a 7-year-old who believed, as 7-year-olds should believe, that the world was large and full of things worth paying attention to. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and found the envelope he'd brought out from the kitchen counter. His February Social Security check, deposited and cleared, the paper statement folded once. He turned it over in his hands. The amount on it was what it was, not extravagant, not precarious. Every dollar of it traceable to 35 years of work done carefully and honestly, for which he had asked nothing more than what was owed. He put the envelope back in his pocket. He looked up at the treehouse, at the cedar decking and the stainless hardware and the small hinged window catching the March light, and he thought about foundations. About the ones you poured in the ground and the ones you built in the relationships between people. About the difference between a structure that merely looks sound and a structure that is sound, all the way through, at every level, in every joint. At 69, he had lost things he had expected to keep. He had also found things he hadn't expected to find, the clarity that comes when the documentation is complete. The steadiness that turns out to be still there, under everything, when you stop taking it for granted. Up in the treehouse, Maya's voice settled into a quieter register. The sound of a child who has found the thing she was looking for and is now simply in it, content. Frank stood in his backyard in the early March light and let the afternoon be what it was. At 69, I finally learned, he thought, that starting over isn't a failure. It's a new foundation. The maple tree held the treehouse the way it had held everything he'd asked it to hold. The branches were steady. The joints were sound. He stayed until the light changed. Friends, how did you find Frank's story today? I've been sitting with this one for a while, and I have to say there's something about Frank Miller that stays with you. A man who spent 35 years making sure the structures other people lived in were safe. Who trusted his son, and his son's wife, and who paid for that trust in ways that would have broken a lot of people. Who sat in a kitchen at 69 years old, with a cease and desist letter on the table. And his late wife's photograph on the counter, and chose not to fall apart. What I keep coming back to is the legal pad. That simple yellow legal pad where Frank started writing things down, what he saw, what he heard, what he'd signed, what he'd given. Not out of anger, though the anger was there. Out of precision. Out of the understanding that you cannot fix what you haven't honestly looked at. We all have a legal pad somewhere, don't we? There are things in our lives that we've half seen and not quite named. People we've trusted past the point where the evidence suggested we should. Documents we signed because the moment was moving and we didn't want to be the one who slowed it down. Frank's story is a reminder that it is never too late to pick up the pen and start writing it down. To look at the foundation, really look at it, and then decide what to do about what you find. And what he found, in the end, was this: that the most important structure he had left to build was not a case. Not a legal proceeding, not a paper trail, though all of those mattered. It was a treehouse. 16 feet of cedar and stainless steel and proper load calculations, built for one 7-year-old girl who needed her grandfather to still be there. Who needed to know that some things hold. Some things hold, friends. Even after the worst of it. Especially after the worst of it. If this story moved you today, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story of your own about standing up, starting over,